Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. So great to have you again.
Hi. Good to be here.
You're actually here in Israel, which is very exciting for all of us, but you couldn't make it into the studio today. Very busy man. But let's get started. Busy. There you go. Well, Professor, as you know, every week we open our show with a special guest. Today we're honored to have several special guests who are attending the Institute of International Strategic Studies in Tel Aviv. We'll start with David Ignatius, the renowned Washington Post columnist. David would like to share some of his thoughts and get your take on what we can expect during the Trump era.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your great work. What can we expect from the Trump administration? Who knows? But we certainly expected a lot from the Obama administration. After all, he got the Nobel Prize 7 minutes after he was elected president, and I can't imagine anybody doing worse on Syria than the Obama-Kerry administration. They did absolutely nothing. The killing continued. Perhaps even got worse. We can look back and wonder whether it was the president setting a red line and then failing to comply with it that emboldened the Russians and the Iranians. Whatever the cause is, the Obama administration failed and failed miserably in Syria. The human rights community failed miserably in Syria. Human rights organizations spend more time condemning Israel than condemning Syria. You couldn't get a demonstration and a march on college campuses about Syria unless you threw Israel in. If you throw Israel in, you can get the students out. That's true more even in Europe than it is in the United States. Every demonstration turns into a demonstration against Israel. And, you would joke, the only way you could get people interested in Syria is if somehow you got Israel involved in the conflict or Jews involved in the conflict, then the world would be up in arms. The United Nations might actually pay some attention instead of spending all of their time condemning Israel and almost none of their time trying to get involved in a constructive way in Syria. And so the situation really can't get any worse. What is scary about the coming Trump administration is its unpredictability, and that might contribute to the growing instability around the world. Syria may be the best example of the tragedy of what has become, unfortunately, the failed human rights community.
Next, let's hear from Hope Rubin, who hails from Washington, D.C. She works in the Center for Mind, Body, and Medicine, an organization that helps people deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. Hope actually just attended the Women's March in D.C. that's been all over international news, and she wants to talk to you about that.
Well, thank you. My wife, daughter, and many, many friends participated in the event. I wish there was as much enthusiasm before the election as there was after the election. I suspect that a great many of the people who participated in that march did not vote for Hillary Clinton. They voted for Jill Stein, who was a bigot, and they voted for Johnson, who doesn't know where Aleppo was. So I think the tragedy is that the great enthusiasm only came about after the election rather than during the election itself. Um, the answer is not the radical left any more than it is the radical right. We have to start moving the dialogue toward the center, and I'd like to see more intellectual approaches rather than emotional ones toward the Trump administration. I don't think celebrities are going to solve this problem for us. I do think that intelligent women and men writing and speaking and doing op-eds and testifying will have much more of an impact than an occasional street demonstration that next day is all but forgotten. So yeah, I'm for demonstrations and marches. I participated in many of them during the civil rights movement, but it has to be followed up with litigation, with legislation, and with intellectual critiques of the excesses of the incoming administration.
Thanks, Professor. Now let's turn to Marcus Sheff. Marcus runs an organization that monitors textbooks and curriculums for bias. Let's hear what's on his mind. He has a very interesting question for you.
That's a great question. And of course, the efforts at Oslo, which led to the Oslo Accords, requires the Palestinians to change their curriculum and stop inciting violence. And the Palestinian leadership incites violence in many different ways, honoring and making martyrs out of murderers of young children and families and babies, naming parks after terrorists and soccer fields after terrorists. The curriculum is one part of that. And we're seeing the United Nations doing its part in incentivizing this kind of radical approach. The resolution of the United Nations, which says basically that the Jews have no right to occupy the Western Wall or Hebrew University or the access road to Hadassah Hospital or the Jewish Quarter of Jerusalem, will encourage violence because now Palestinians will say, look, they're occupying our land. We have the right to liberate it. And we're going to see, I think, more and more violence resulting from that, from UNESCO's declaration that there's no Jewish history or Jewish connection. So I think the Palestinian Authority has to be stopped in its inciting of violence. If it were not the organization it was, it might very well be on the list of terrorist organizations in the United States and in Europe. it fits some of the criteria of a terrorist organization by encouraging and inciting violence, but obviously nobody wants to put them on the list because that would end any real possibility of them being a partner for peace in the two-state solution. Right now, the Palestinian Authority, as long as it continues to incite violence through its textbooks and through its honoring of martyrs, is not a partner for peace. It's violating all the traditions and all the accords, and it got a tiny little slap on the wrist for that from the UN resolution from the Kerry speech, but disproportionately smaller than the very, very deep punch in the stomach that Israel got for its settlement policy. So I think the fault is very widespread, but I think under the Trump administration, we're going to see a movement toward cutting off funds to the Palestinian Authority unless they change their tune with regard to incentivizing and inciting terrorism.
All right, Professor. Now we have the chance to hear from a student. Gabrielle has a question about strategic planning. Sounds a lot like a course you once gave at Harvard called Thinking About Thinking.
Well, thank you for your great question. I think everybody should always implement strategic planning. Strategic planning simply means looking over the short and middle term to longer term and to broader resolutions. The Israelis' military is very good at both strategic long-term planning, looking forward with some concern about the day Iran gets to spin more centrifuges and gets a pathway to a nuclear arsenal. That's a kind of strategic thinking that has to be done. I think strategic thinking about how the instability around the world might impact Israel, strategic thinking about the impact of the economy on peace. So I'm all for strategic thinking, and I commend you and what you and others are doing in terms of thinking through the strategic implications of all the crises that we can look forward to. The Chinese curses, may you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times, and we have to always be ahead of the curve in thinking about what the implications are for countries that we seek to protect.
Absolutely. Now, Professor, our final question comes from Hillel Neuer, who heads a well-known organization called UN Watch all the way in Geneva, Switzerland. You've worked together in the past, but his question is more about the future.
Hillel, not only thank you for your great question, but for the amazing work that you do. I was with you in Geneva when Ahmadinejad Was invited by the United Nations notoriously to deliver an address. We were there, we walked out, and I think we confronted Ahmadinejad. I was briefly arrested and detained because I wanted to ask him a question. I wanted to challenge him to debate me about the Holocaust at Auschwitz, and I was not allowed to ask my question, but instead was dragged out and detained by the Swiss police, saying they had an obligation to protect President Ahmadinejad, protect him physically, but not from hard questions. One of the great disappointments in my life has been the United Nations. I worked for Justice Goldberg as a law clerk, and when he became the head of the United States delegation to the United Nations, I did some informal consultation with him. I was a member of the United Nations Association. I used to visit the United Nations as a young person. I'm going to say something controversial. Knowing everything I know now, if I had a choice between there being a United Nations or not being a United Nations, I would say over the last quarter century, I would say I wish there had not been a United Nations. Look, it did some good. It helped to establish the state of Israel by dividing the mandate into a nation state for the Jewish people, a nation state for the Arab people. But since that time, it's hard to find very much good that it's done in the world. But I agree with you. I think we have to engage. I think we should have a very distinguished ambassador, a very articulate ambassador to the Human Rights Council. Not that it will do any good. The votes are predetermined. It was, I think, Abiy Ibn who once said if Algeria introduced a resolution that the earth was flat and that Israel flattened it, it would win 120 to 43 with 61 abstentions. It's predictable. On the other hand, we have to continue to engage and fight back. And I think the new administration will engage. The new representative to the UN is an articulate woman who wants to engage, I think. And she certainly will have my support and your support in trying to maybe revolutionize the United Nations and make it a place that its founders could be proud of. Today, its founders are turning over in their grave in horrible disappointment as the United Nations has been hijacked by some of the most evil forces in the world to produce some of the most evil results in history.
All right, Alan, so we'll end with a question about a current event that's taking place. Israel approved 560 new homes to be constructed in East Jerusalem. That move came just after Donald J. Trump was inaugurated as the President of the United States. What is your take on that decision, and why do you think it's happening now?
Well, I have been since 1973 opposed to settlement expansion on the West Bank. I think Jerusalem is a different situation. Ultimately, Jerusalem should be a united city. Everybody should be able to live in every part of Jerusalem, but I think it is a mistake now to expand housing permits in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank. I understand the policy of building up but not out in the West Bank, and I understand too that the Netanyahu administration has tried to clamp down on illegal settlement building deep into the West Bank, and perhaps this was all part of a deal to delay and postpone having annexation votes brought in front of the United Nations, because my understanding is the Prime Minister will be meeting with the President before long, and certainly nothing should be done to change the status quo until after that meeting occurs and until some sense is obtained as to what the policy of the Trump administration will be toward settlement building. The Obama administration has had the most destructive policy. What they've done is basically blamed the failure of the peace process almost exclusively on settlement building, which is wrong and false. They haven't distinguished between building in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, building in East Jerusalem, or building in the deepest parts of the West Bank. They have painted with far too broad a brush, and that's been, I think, destructive. But I would hope that Israel can be more intelligent about its building policy than the United States was under President Obama. So I would take prudence and caution and leave the status quo now. Let's have a meeting between the Prime Minister and the President and let's get a better sense of what the Trump administration's policy will be toward building and toward other issues in the American-Israel relationship. I think we can all hope for a better relationship than the one that existed under the Obama administration. And one would hope America has learned the lesson over and over again that Dennis Ross has tried to teach us. When you do not support Israel, Israel does not make moves toward compromise as freely as it does when the United States does support Israel. So anybody who wants to see Israel make more concessions, make more compromises, be open to more sacrifices, all they have to do is provide Israel with enormous support and backing strategically and tactically, and you'll see, if history follows a course, that Israel will respond as it did so many times in the past by offering the kinds of two-state solution peace offers that they did and have been rejected by the Palestinians up to now. But perhaps if they keep making these offers, there will come a time when the Palestinian leadership will want their own state more than they want to see that there is no nation state for the Jewish people. And when that time occurs, we will finally see the circumstances ready for the adoption of a two-state solution.
All right, Professor. That's all the time we have for today. We'll end our show with looking towards the future that you speak of. Thanks for your time. And I also want to thank all of our distinguished guests, especially David Ignatius, Marcus Sheff, and Hillel Noor. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.